Rain pounded the rental car's windshield in waves that turned the glass into a wall of water. Elizabeth Mitchell had been sitting in the parking lot of Clayton's Diner for 10 minutes, engine off, watching the early shift arrive through the downpour. At 57, she'd learned that the truth of any business lived in details that never made it into quarterly reports. She checked the mirror. The salon blowout was gone, deliberately messed up with water and her fingers. The $700 blazer stayed in the hotel closet. A faded Goodwill zip-up replaced it. Diamond studs swapped for plastic hoops from a drugstore bin. To anyone looking, she was invisible, just another woman killing time over coffee. Sterling Restaurant Group had grown from one roadside breakfast counter 27 years ago into 27 diners across 6 states. Her business philosophy could fit on a napkin. Take better care of your lowest-paid employee than your most important customer. Investors frowned at it during pitch meetings. Her MBA executives suggested she soften the language for board presentations. She'd never softened it. The lesson came from her mother first. Elizabeth had been 9, stranded in a dead station wagon during a November storm on a North Carolina highway. A gas station attendant stopped to help push them to safety. Carol Mitchell pressed her last bills into his hands despite his protests, her voice leaving no room for argument. We share what we have with people who help when they don't have to. Elizabeth watched her mother count their remaining money that night in a motel that smelled like mildew. Carol's hands trembled as she smoothed the bills, doing math on whether they could afford dinner and breakfast or just one. She smiled anyway and said they'd figure it out. But Margaret Wilson had truly shaped everything after. Margaret owned a small Chattanooga hotel, nothing fancy but clean. She found Elizabeth at 17, sleeping on a bus terminal bench with a backpack holding everything she owned. Instead of calling police, Margaret sat beside her and asked if she was hungry. Elizabeth had been too tired to lie. Margaret brought her inside, fed her, gave her a room, offered her a housekeeping job the next morning. No questions about where she'd come from, just an offer with clear expectations. People don't fail because they don't try. They fail because the world doesn't give them a fair shot. All you need is one person willing to bet on you. Elizabeth spent 10 years learning everything Margaret taught. Housekeeping first, stripping beds, scrubbing toilets, learning dignity lived in any job done well, front desk work next, reading people in 30 seconds, figuring out who needed quiet rooms and who'd skip the bill, food service at a diner 2 blocks over, bookkeeping with Margaret at the hotel office desk, learning to read financial statements and spot problems early. By 27, Elizabeth had saved enough for a deposit on a breakfast spot outside Atlanta. Margaret co-signed the loan without hesitation. Sterling Restaurant Group began in that moment. Margaret had been gone 9 years, heart attack in her sleep. Elizabeth kept one photograph on her office credenza, the only personal item in a room of reports and projections. Every decision, every policy, every unannounced visit in a Goodwill jacket traced back to those words. Carol, 82 now and living in Charlotte, had said something similar once. Elizabeth had been 23, exhausted after a double shift, wondering if she'd made a mistake. The only thing you own is what you do when somebody needs help, and you're standing there. Carol said it like stating a fact. Elizabeth wrote it on a napkin, carried it in her wallet for 2 years before she believed it. The quarterly report on the passenger seat showed Clayton's Diner had lost 14 employees in 7 months, 14 out of 32 staff. The documentation called it voluntary separation or mutual decision or better opportunity elsewhere. Sanitized language that revealed nothing. Numbers told you what, for why you showed up in person. Elizabeth grabbed her canvas tote and stepped into the rain. Water soaked through the jacket immediately. Good. Women in cashmere coats got remembered. Women getting rained on were scenery. The diner's interior matched the financials. Linoleum worn gray where servers walked between kitchen and tables. Vinyl booths patched with electrical tape. Coffee and bacon grease smells that no cleaner could remove. The scent of a place that had been working for decades. A server in her 50s called from behind the counter, voice warm. "Sit anywhere you like, hon." Elizabeth chose a corner booth with clear views of the kitchen pass-through, register, and dining floor. She pulled out a worn paperback, settling in like someone planning to stay. The morning rush hit like a flood. Construction workers with muddy boots, office workers grabbing food to go, regulars sliding into usual seats without checking menus. Noise climbed, plates clattering, grill hissing, ticket printer spitting orders. That's when she saw James Walker. Mid-20s at most, though something in how he carried himself suggested he'd lived more than his years should hold. Tall, over 6 feet, lean from work, not gyms. Deep brown skin caught the fluorescent lights, making the exhaustion around his eyes more pronounced. His name tag, written in careful blue marker, read James. He worked 7 tables with focused efficiency that made Elizabeth set her book down. He caught a water glass before it fell off a tray, reflexive, smooth, unnoticed by anyone else. He calmed a customer complaining about overcooked eggs, not with apologies, but with explanation, and a replacement plate arriving before the man stopped frowning. He made change in his head, recited a 4-top order from memory without writing anything, and kept one eye on the adjacent section, covering for someone who disappeared. 2 jobs at once, without calling attention, without complaint, without slowing. Elizabeth had run restaurants long enough to recognize real competence. This wasn't going through motions. This was understanding the work at a level that usually took years. But he kept disappearing into the back, never longer than 4 minutes. He always checked his tables first, made sure coverage was solid, then slipped through the storage area door with timing that suggested he didn't want it noticed. When he came back, his face was arranged too carefully into professional neutral, the mask of someone who'd been doing something other than restocking supplies. At the 20-minute mark, James vanished again. Through the pass-through, Elizabeth watched other servers scramble to cover. A young woman with gel nails rolled her eyes at a coworker. They both smirked. 3 minutes, 40 seconds later, Elizabeth had watched the clock. James returned, face carefully composed, apron straightened with too much precision. But she saw what he worked to hide. Slight redness around his eyes, jaw set like he was holding himself together through pure will. He'd been in there, trying not to cry. Elizabeth was still processing when the back office door slammed open hard enough to rattle coat hooks. "Walker!" The voice cut through the rush like a blade. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Even the grill seemed to quiet. The man who emerged was late 40s, broad through the middle, polo shirt straining at the buttons. His name tag read Donald Harris, manager in embossed plastic. He moved across the floor with swagger that said he believed authority was something you wore. His eyes locked on James with contempt that wasn't fresh. This had been building. "Walker, what the hell do you think you're doing back there?" James turned slowly, face pale but voice level. "Mr. Harris, I was just—" "You abandoned your section during morning rush. Tables unserved, customers waiting. Think this place runs itself?" Elizabeth scanned the room. No customers looked distressed. James's section had been covered smoothly enough that most people hadn't noticed he'd left. This wasn't correction, this was performance. "Sir, I was gone less than 4 minutes. Jenny and Marcus covered—" 25 minutes! Donald's voice climbed, face flushing red. "You've been disappearing all morning. Think I haven't been watching? That's not accurate, sir. I've been—" "Don't tell me what's accurate in my restaurant." Donald stepped into James's space, close enough that nearby customers shifted in their seats. Elizabeth's hands tightened on her cup. I know what you've been doing. I know about your situation. I know you've got that kid stashed in my storage room like this is daycare. Think I'm blind? Complete silence, the kind that felt like pressure. James's voice dropped, urgent. Mr. Harris, please. Can we take this to your office, please? Oh, now you want privacy. Donald's volume went up, ensuring every person in the room could hear. You brought a sick child into a food service establishment. Know what the health department says about that? Know what our liability looks like? Mr. Harris, you want to explain yourself? Fine. Tell everyone why you thought this was acceptable. James's composure cracked for half a second before he pulled it together. My son has a fever of 102. School called at 5:45 this morning. My aunt is 73, doesn't drive, lives 40 minutes away. I called 4 people. Nobody could come on short notice. I don't have a car, his voice caught, slight but audible. My wife died when my son was 3. My father died 6 months ago. There's nobody else. I couldn't leave him home alone, and I couldn't miss today. This would be my 3rd absence this month. And you made it clear. 3 absences means automatic termination. He's in the far back corner of the storage room, nowhere near food prep. I made sure. I just needed to get through today. Elizabeth had set her book down entirely. Near the window, an older woman in a rain jacket stopped eating, watching Donald with an unfriendly expression. I don't care what you made sure of. Donald crossed his arms, almost satisfied. You brought a sick minor into my establishment without permission. Health code violation. Liability issue. Grounds for immediate termination. He paused for effect. James Walker, you're fired. Effective now. Collect your things. Get your kid. Get out of my restaurant. Complete silence. Even the kitchen went still. Mr. Harris. James's voice barely rose above a whisper. Please, we need today's pay. I have groceries. Should have thought about that before you ran a babysitting operation on company time. 5 minutes to clear out. 6 minutes. I'm calling police. James stood motionless, shoulders rigid, hands clenched. Then, chin held level, he walked toward the back with careful dignity, refusing to let them take his composure no matter what else they took. He came out less than a minute later, carrying a child. Elizabeth's breath caught. The boy was small, 7 at most, slight, and dark-skinned like his father. Bundled in a school hoodie too thin for the weather, fabric worn from many washings. His head rested on James's shoulder, completely boneless, a sick child who'd given up trying to hold himself upright. Cheeks deeply flushed, eyes barely open, his whole body radiating that stillness of a fever that had taken all the fight out. In one small hand, he clutched a plastic dinosaur, a T-Rex, worn smooth from handling. Even feverish and exhausted, he held it like it mattered more than anything. He looked very small in his father's arms. From the window booth, the older woman spoke clearly. Somebody ought to be ashamed. She wasn't looking at James. His name is Michael. He's 7. He doesn't like loud noises when he has a fever. James's voice came quiet but clear for the record, even though there'd be no official record. He walked past Donald without looking, past frozen servers, past silent customers, past Elizabeth's booth. Their eyes met for 1 second. She saw everything laid bare. Fear of someone too young carrying this weight alone. Exhaustion from holding things together by will for longer than anyone should. Desperate terror of watching the one fragile structure of stability begin to come apart. It was the look Elizabeth had seen on her own face 40 years ago in a Chattanooga bus terminal bathroom. James pushed through the door into rain that had picked up again, coming down in sheets. No umbrella, no car. He tucked Michael's head under his chin, adjusted his grip to shelter the boy, started walking east toward the cheaper side of town. Rain soaked them both within seconds. Through the windows, Elizabeth watched them get smaller until the storm swallowed them completely. She stood, put a 10 on the table for coffee she'd barely touched, picked up her tote, but she didn't follow James into the rain. Not yet. Instead, she walked directly to where Donald stood near the register, wearing the expression of someone who believed he'd handled a difficult situation correctly. "Excuse me." Her voice was pleasant, unhurried, level. Donald barely glanced at her. Rain-damp zip-up, plastic earrings, canvas tote. His expression placed her in a category, unimportant. "Someone will be with you in a minute, ma'am. I don't need service. I need your full name and official title." He looked then, really looked, taking her in, finding her beneath concern. "Donald Harris, manager. You have a complaint about what just happened. There's a feedback form on our website." Donald Harris. Elizabeth said it like confirming against a document, tone shifting cooler. "Manager at Clayton's Diner, employed by Sterling Restaurant Group, 8 years. Transferred here from Montgomery 2 years ago, Savannah before that, 14 employee separations at this location in 7 months." She paused, watching color leave his face. "Those numbers accurate? Who are you?" Elizabeth reached into her tote, produced her real wallet, set a business card on the counter between them, watched him read it, watched realization cross his face like storm clouds. "Elizabeth Mitchell, CEO, Sterling Restaurant Group. I own this company." 2 seconds of silence. "You're terminated effective immediately. My HR director is being contacted now. We'll reach you within the hour about final pay and paperwork. I'd like you to leave the premises. You can't just—" "I have rights. There are procedures. There are procedures for many things, including documentation of abusive conduct patterns across multiple locations that should have resulted in your termination years ago rather than transfers that just move the problem around." Elizabeth's voice stayed quiet, which somehow made it worse than shouting. "Leave now, Mr. Harris." "Quietly, please." He left. Not quietly, grabbed his jacket, slammed the back door hard enough that customers flinched. But he left. Elizabeth turned to stunned staff. "Who's the assistant manager?" A woman in her early 40s raised her hand slowly. "Me, Linda Brown." "Ms. Brown, you're interim manager as of now. Someone from corporate will reach you within the hour." "Can you keep the restaurant running through today's service?" "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely." "Good. Everyone else, back to work. Sorry for the disruption." Elizabeth walked back to her booth, sat, picked up her phone. Calls to make, termination to process, personnel file to untangle, HR, director to have an uncomfortable conversation with before day's end. But for a long moment, she made none of those calls. She sat watching rain run down windows, thinking about a young man walking east in that downpour with his sick child pressed against his chest, thinking about Margaret Wilson and what it meant to honor a debt that could never be repaid, only passed forward. Then she picked up her phone and started dialing. Elizabeth sat at the hotel desk, reading glasses on, laptop open to a file Barbara Nolan had compiled in 3 hours. Barbara had been her assistant 12 years, the most efficient human she'd ever encountered. James Walker, 25, hired 11 weeks ago as a server. No disciplinary record until this week. Then 2 tardiness write-ups in 9 days, both signed by Donald Harris, building a paper trail. Classic manager move when they had already decided someone needed to go. High school diploma from Westbrook, graduated 6 years ago. Grades suggested capability, but probably not luxury of making education primary focus. No college. Employment history showed service industry jobs. Nothing lasting over 8 months until his father died, and everything apparently stabilized at Clayton's. Family circumstances made her set down her pen. Sarah Walker, deceased 4 years prior at 22, breast cancer. Diagnosed at 20, fought 2 years, left behind a husband, barely legal drinking age, and a 3-year-old son. Robert Walker, deceased 6 months ago at 48. Workplace accident, construction site, fell 3 stories when scaffolding gave way. He'd been supporting James and his grandson the 4 years between Sarah's death and his own. After Robert died, James moved into his own place. 2-bedroom in Eastfield, cost significantly more than a 1-bedroom, but gave Michael his own space. No vehicle registered. Almost no credit history, meaning he'd been operating cash and debit, never carrying balances. Applied for state assistance when his father died. Denied on a technicality, age and employment classification. Over 21, working enough hours that he didn't qualify for certain programs, but not earning enough to actually make ends meet. Currently appealing, which Barbara noted moved at continental drift speed and rarely resulted in reversals. Family support minimal to non-existent. Robert's sister Patricia lived in Harborview, 40 minutes by car, 75 by bus. 73, no driver's license, living on Social Security. Sarah's family somewhere in Ohio, possible estrangement with a question mark. Barbara couldn't confirm from public records. Everything James told Donald that morning was accurate. No support network available on short notice. No backup when school called at dawn with a sick child. Elizabeth closed the laptop, looked out at rain, finally easing. She thought about herself at 17, alone on a bench. About Margaret sitting beside her with an offer that changed everything. About her mother counting bills in a motel, making impossible decisions about which necessities to prioritize. She picked up her phone, dialed the number from James's file. 2 rings. Hello? Young, cautious, wary. James, my name is Elizabeth Mitchell. I own Sterling Restaurant Group, which operates Clayton's Diner.
I was at the restaurant this morning. I witnessed what happened. I'd like to speak with you if you're willing.
Silence. 5 full seconds. Is this about something legal? Because I didn't do anything wrong. Michael was nowhere near food prep. I made sure you're not in trouble. You did nothing wrong. Mr. Harris has been terminated. Won't be returning to that restaurant or any Sterling location. Elizabeth kept her voice steady, the tone she used with spooked investors. I'd like to meet in person tomorrow afternoon at 2 at the diner, if that works. I want to hear your story and discuss whether there's something I can do to make this right. No obligations, no strings, just a conversation. Another silence, longer. Why would you do that? Because what happened this morning was wrong. And because someone did something similar for me long ago when I was young with nothing and nowhere to go. I've spent every year since trying to be worthy of what she gave me. Pause. I hope you'll come tomorrow. 2 o'clock. Bring Michael if you need to. No child care judgment here. Quiet then. Okay. 2 o'clock. After she hung up, Elizabeth opened a new document. Not about Donald or termination. She started listing Sterling Restaurant Group's support systems, programs that existed on paper but might as well be invisible if people didn't know about them. Employee Support Fund, 7 years old, genuinely funded, genuinely useful for exactly the emergency James faced. Child Care Partnership Network, agreements with licensed providers in every Sterling city, subsidized rates. Emergency assistance for rent, utilities, medical bills, tuition reimbursement. How many at Clayton's knew any of this existed? How many got hired, skimmed an employee handbook once, never opened it again, left to figure out help was available if they just knew where to look? Elizabeth stared at that question a long time before writing the answer. James arrived exactly at 2 the next afternoon, holding Michael by the hand. The boy looked better than yesterday, still pale, but with color returning, brightness in his eyes, suggesting the fever had broken properly. Clean shirt, plastic dinosaur in his free hand, gripped like he went nowhere without it. Elizabeth stood, same corner booth, positioning herself where window light put her face in shadow, theirs in better illumination. Old negotiating trick from watching Margaret handle difficult guests. "James, thank you for coming." She looked down at Michael, who studied her with careful assessment, a child who'd learned young that adults couldn't always be trusted to be kind. "And who's this?" "My son, Michael." James's voice carried quiet steadiness, speaking about his son with protectiveness and pride. "Hi, Michael." She gestured to the dinosaur. "That's a very impressive dinosaur. What kind?" Michael held it up, serious. "Tyrannosaurus Rex. He's the king. He protects me from bad dreams." "I didn't know dinosaurs could do that. Very useful skill. Most people don't know." Michael said it gravely, like an ongoing educational problem he'd accepted he couldn't fully solve, but felt obligated to address. Elizabeth had arranged hot chocolate and crackers. Michael settled in the booth corner within 30 seconds, dinosaur propped against the sugar dispenser, absorbed in dunking crackers and trying to drink without getting a mustache. She and James sat across from each other. "Mr. Harris is no longer with the company. Permanent. What he did yesterday, the public nature, how he spoke to you, firing you for trying to care for your family, that violated everything this company stands for." Elizabeth met his eyes directly. "I also want to tell you I reviewed your file and looked at some public records. I know about Sarah. I know about your father. I'm very sorry for your losses." Something moved through James's face. Not quite pain, not quite relief. More like bracing for impact and encountering unexpected gentleness. "You looked into me. I needed to understand your situation before coming to you, because I wanted to make a real offer, not a gesture." "I don't do gestures." She leaned forward slightly. "I watched you work 90 minutes yesterday before the incident. How you managed your section, handled complaints, anticipated what people needed before they asked. That doesn't come from training. That's instinct and intelligence working together. You were also covering part of another server's section simultaneously, without being asked, without calling attention. In 27 years running restaurants, I can tell you that awareness is genuinely rare." James waited, listening for the catch that always existed. "I'd like to offer you assistant manager at this location. You'd work under Linda Brown, who's being promoted to full manager. Salary is $37,000 a year with full benefits. Health coverage for you and Michael, dental, vision, paid time off. After 3 to 6 months learning our systems, you'd be eligible for promotion to full manager here or another region location." Elizabeth slid a folder across the table. "Our benefits include tuition reimbursement for courses related to your role if you want additional education." James looked at the folder but didn't open it. He sat back, looked at Michael, absorbed in chocolate and crackers and dinosaur, unaware of the conversation. James watched his son long, the flush fading from cheeks, how Michael held the dinosaur while eating, like letting go might cause something to go wrong. When James looked back, something had shifted in his face, careful composure giving way to something rawer. "I appreciate what you're trying to do. I really do. But I can't take this." Elizabeth hadn't expected that, kept her expression neutral. "Tell me why." "Because assistant managers means longer hours. Staying late when things go wrong. Being the person called at 11 at night when a shift falls apart." James shook his head slightly. "I can't afford any of that. I get Michael up at 6:15 every morning, walk him to school, come to work, pick him up, make dinner, help with homework, get him to bed, then set everything up for the next morning." His voice stayed controlled, but exhaustion underneath was real, unguarded. "That's the day. Every single day. No room for more responsibility. Evening shifts running late. Emergency calls at night. If I take this and start dropping things at work or home, Michael pays for it. He's already lost everything that matters. I won't let him lose the one thing he still has, me being there when he needs me." Elizabeth listened without interrupting, watching his hands tense on the table. "The tuition reimbursement, going back to school?" James paused, something painful crossing his face. "I had to let that go. When my father died, I had plans. Night classes, business degree eventually, build towards something better. I withdrew from the community college program I'd enrolled in because Michael needed stability more than I needed college. That's the math. I made peace with it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm grateful for what you're offering, Ms. Mitchell. Sincerely. But the right answer for me now is a job I can do well and still be home by 6. This isn't that job." Michael looked up. "Dad, can I have another cracker?" "Yeah, buddy." James slid the plate closer without looking away from Elizabeth. "The dinosaur wants one too." Michael's voice was serious. "The dinosaur can have half of yours." Michael considered this with gravity. "Okay, that's fair." Elizabeth watched this exchange, the automatic ease, how James tracked Michael without making it surveillance, how Michael leaned slightly toward his father, the way plants leaned toward light. She understood with complete clarity what she was seeing. Not a young man who didn't want opportunity, someone who wanted it so badly he'd taught himself not to want it, because wanting things you'd decided you couldn't have was its own ongoing grief. "Can I tell you something?" "Sure. When I was 17, I was living on a bus terminal bench in Chattanooga with a backpack and no plan. Margaret Wilson found me, gave me a job and place to stay. About 6 weeks later, she offered me shift supervisor. More hours, more responsibility, more pay." James waited. "I turned it down. Told her I wasn't ready, didn't want to risk losing what I had. It was too much, too fast." Elizabeth paused. "What I didn't say, barely admitted to myself, I was terrified. If I took on more and failed, I'd lose the only stable thing I'd found. I was protecting myself by staying small. That's not the same thing. You were protecting yourself. I'm protecting Michael." "Yes. And I want you to think carefully about how similar those two things actually are." Elizabeth leaned forward. "Margaret didn't argue when I refused, just said, 'All right, come back when you're ready,' and kept the offer open. Few weeks later, I watched her spend an evening sorting applications for a front desk position. She interviewed 5 people over 2 days. I watched and thought I could do that better. I could see what she was looking for. I could do it better than anyone she interviewed. And the only reason I was watching from outside, instead of sitting in that chair, was because I'd talked myself out of it." She held his eyes. "I went to her the next morning, told her I'd changed my mind. She smiled, said she'd been waiting for me to figure that out." Michael set the dinosaur down, making it walk in slow steps toward the table edge, then back. "Small patrol-keeping order. I'm not asking you to abandon your son for a career. I'm asking you to consider there might be a version where you don't have to choose between being a good father and building something for both your futures." Elizabeth tapped the folder. "Open it, please." James opened it slowly. Elizabeth walked him through everything, page by page. Specific dollar amounts, specific programs, specific contacts. Vague reassurances meant nothing to someone who'd learned systems failed and promises evaporated. Employee support fund could cover emergencies. Mornings when school called at dawn with nowhere to turn. Childcare partnership network included 3 licensed providers within 2 miles. Subsidized rates, slots for before school, after school, occasional sick mornings when a child couldn't go to school but wasn't ER level sick. James read one page carefully, then again. This child care partnership. This is real? 3 providers within 2 miles, subsidized through the fund, available for situations like yesterday. Real and available starting immediately if you take this position. I spoke with one this morning, Angela Young. She's done childcare 20 years, has an orange tabby named Captain, has immediate availability for after-school and emergency morning coverage. James looked at Michael, deep in Dinosaur Patrol. "Hey, bud." Michael looked up. "Remember Mrs. Patterson from the park? The one with the thermos of lemonade?" Michael thought carefully. "The one with the orange cat? That's her friend Angela. Angela takes care of kids after school. She has the cat." Michael processed this. "What's the cat's name?" "Captain." Michael seemed to feel this required proper consideration. "That's a good name for a cat. We should meet him before we decide anything." "Absolutely fair." James looked back at Elizabeth. Something different in his expression now. Still cautious, but the closed door had cracked open, allowing possibility of light. "What if I take this and it falls apart in 3 weeks? What if you've misread this and I fail and Michael ends up worse off than now? Then we figure out what went wrong and what you need to succeed. Maybe more training, maybe a different role, maybe something else entirely." "I'm not betting on perfection, James." Elizabeth met his gaze. "I'm betting on the person I watched work yesterday morning. I'm betting on someone who, when the worst thing happened to his family, didn't leave. He stayed and figured it out one day at a time, which is the only way anyone ever figures anything out." Pause. "Your father believed a man's value was what he did when nobody was watching. Your wife believed the most important thing you could do was show up for people who needed you, consistently, no matter what." James's breath caught, slight. "Those two people raised you to do exactly what you're doing for Michael. I don't think they'd call it selfish to also build something for yourself. I think they'd call it exactly right." Silence stretched between them, heavy with decisions that'd ripple into futures neither could see clearly. Michael set the dinosaur carefully in the table center, like placing a small ambassador at a summit. "Dad? Yeah? Is this the lady trying to help us?" James looked at his son. "Yeah, she is." Michael looked at Elizabeth with the direct gaze of a 7-year-old who took important evaluations seriously, who'd learned young the world wasn't always safe and adults weren't always kind, but some of them, sometimes, could be trusted. "Okay." Satisfied with whatever he saw, Michael went back to his chocolate. James watched his son another moment, then looked back. "If I take this and Michael needs me, if school calls, if he's sick, if something happens requiring me to be there, I go. Every single time. Whatever it takes. I want that in writing. You go every time. I'll put that in writing today. I want to be home by 6:30 most nights. I need to know that's the baseline expectation, not the exception. We'll build the schedule around that as standard, not special accommodation. I want to understand everything I'm agreeing to before I agree. Every policy, every expectation, every detail. That's exactly the right instinct. Take the folder home, read every word. Call me tomorrow with questions. I'll answer every one." Another pause. Michael humming to himself, while Rex stood guard over the sugar dispenser. The cat's name. Both adults looked at him. "We should really find out more about Captain first." Michael's voice was perfectly reasonable. "You're absolutely right. I'll make that my first priority." Elizabeth pulled out her phone, dialed Angela's number right there, put it on speaker so Michael could hear. Angela confirmed. Captain was an orange tabby of considerable dignity who permitted careful petting from people he decided to trust. 12 years old, preferred tuna treats, known to sit on children's laps during story time if they stayed very still. Michael received this with visible satisfaction. "That's a very good cat. I'd like to meet him." Angela's warm voice came through. "Captain would like to meet you too. He's very particular about his friends, so if he likes you, that means you're a good person." After Elizabeth hung up, James looked at his son one more long moment. Then he straightened the folder, set it squarely in front of him, extended his hand across the table. "Okay, I'll try." Elizabeth shook his hand, feeling calluses on his palm, grip firm without trying to prove anything. That's all anyone can ever really do. The weekend moved at surreal speed, like time had shifted gears, and James could only hold on. Saturday night, after Michael was asleep, he sat at their small kitchen table with a legal pad taking notes, working through the folder page by page, writing down questions and concerns and things he needed to understand better before committing fully. Sunday morning, he called Elizabeth's number, half expecting voicemail, getting her actual voice instead. They talked 45 minutes, James working through his list methodically while Elizabeth answered each question with specific, concrete information. No corporate speak, no vague reassurances, just facts about pay schedules and health insurance enrollment and what the training period would actually look like. Sunday afternoon, he took Michael to meet Angela Young and Captain. The apartment was clean and bright, filled with children's books and art supplies and a comfortable worn couch where Captain held court like the dignified monarch he apparently considered himself. Michael approached the cat with seriousness the situation deserved, moving slowly, speaking softly, waiting for permission before attempting to pet the orange fur. Captain tolerated the introduction, then, after careful assessment, bumped his head against Michael's hand in what Angela explained was highest possible approval. "He likes you. That's not something he does for just anyone." Michael looked up at his father with pure delight. "Dad, this is a really good place." By Monday morning, James stood outside Clayton's at 5:45, 15 minutes before official start time, wearing a new polo with his name embroidered on the chest in navy thread. Health coverage paperwork was being processed on emergency basis. Child care arrangement confirmed and documented. Emergency Assistance Fund had approved a grant covering 2 months' rent, giving him breathing room he hadn't had since his father died. All of it real, documented, verifiable. James had checked everything twice because he'd learned hope was most useful when grounded in facts you could confirm. He unlocked the door and went inside. Linda Brown was already at the counter, reviewing the prep checklist with focused efficiency. She looked up when he entered, expression professionally neutral, the look of someone who'd decided to watch carefully before forming judgment. Linda was 42, had been at Clayton's 4 years, functioning as assistant manager in everything but title, while Donald ran the location into the ground through negligence and cruelty in roughly equal measure. Organized, experienced, deeply skilled at actually running a restaurant. She'd also been recommended for full manager twice by regional assessors and blocked both times by Donald for reasons having nothing to do with her performance and everything to do with his need to control everything around him. When Linda learned a 25-year-old server with 11 weeks' experience was being placed as assistant manager, she'd called Elizabeth directly and asked without preamble for an explanation. Elizabeth took the call, explained what she'd seen and what she believed, asked Linda not to step aside for James, but to build something with him, as his manager with the title and compensation she'd always deserved. The call lasted 40 minutes. Linda hadn't agreed to like the situation, but she'd agreed to engage with it honestly, which Elizabeth said was enough. Morning crew filtered in, reactions ranging from curious to cautious to openly skeptical. Sandra Rodriguez, 4 years at Clayton's, watched James with measuring gaze, someone doing careful math about fairness and opportunity and whether this would work or blow up spectacularly. Brent Lopez kept his expression deliberately flat, the look of someone burned by management promises before, not about to be fooled again. George White, who worked the grill, said nothing and kept prepping his station with focused efficiency, someone who considered this hour too valuable for unnecessary conversation. Linda cut through the low murmur. Good morning. This is James Walker. He worked here as a server until last week. Starting today, he's our assistant manager. James stepped forward. He'd been up until midnight going through different versions of what to say, testing them out loud while Michael slept, trying to find words that sounded authentic rather than rehearsed. Every smooth or polished version felt wrong when tested against the reality of these people, all of whom had been here longer and had every right to be skeptical. He decided to just tell the truth. I know this is strange. I know some of you watched what happened last Tuesday and have questions about how I ended up in this shirt. I'm not going to pretend it makes perfect sense from where you're standing, because it doesn't. He looked around, meeting each set of eyes briefly but directly. What I can tell you is I'm going to work harder than anyone else in this building. I'm going to get things wrong. When I do, I want to hear about it, because you know things about this place I don't know yet, and I'm going to need that knowledge if I'm going to do this job right. James paused, aware of how young he probably sounded, how inexperienced, how unlikely as a leader. Give me 30 days. Watch what I actually do, not what I say. Judge me on results. That's all I'm asking. The silence that followed was people deciding whether to give trust or withhold it, whether this was worth the effort or just another disappointment waiting to happen. Back to work. Linda's voice cut through cleanly. James, you're with me. Opening walkthrough. The day was harder than expected, and he'd expected it to be hard. Physical demands were familiar, rhythms of service and preparation, something his body knew. What was difficult was the weight of constant observation, awareness that every small decision was being silently evaluated by people who hadn't decided whether he had any business making decisions affecting their work, their income, their lives. Linda walked him through opening procedures with efficient professionalism. James took notes on everything, asking specific questions, not about how things worked, but why they were done this particular way rather than some other way. He could tell the specificity occasionally surprised her, caught her off guard in a way suggesting she'd expected him to nod along and pretend to understand rather than digging into actual reasoning. During morning rush, James moved carefully, watching more than directing, learning the flow before trying to alter it. When orders backed up badly at the grill, he stepped in beside George without being asked, working quietly under the older man's guidance, following instructions, rather than trying to lead. George said nothing for the first 8 minutes, observing James's technique with flat, unhurried assessment. Someone who'd spent enough years at a grill to know immediately whether a person actually understood the work or was simply performing competence for an audience. Don't crowd it. Every piece needs its own space or nothing cooks right. Got it. Thank you. A pause during which George flipped 3 eggs without looking at them, hands moving with muscle memory of decades. My son's about your age, works over at the hardware store on Clement Street. George said it without particular emphasis, statement of fact rather than story. What's his name? Marcus. Is he good at the hardware business? Better than I would have been at his age. This appeared to conclude the conversation, but something in the quality of silence had shifted from assessment to provisional acceptance, from stranger to known quantity, even if not yet trusted. James made mistakes throughout the day. Sent a food runner to the wrong table, had to redirect mid-stride. Forgot a plate modification, had to remake an order from scratch. Gave a customer incorrect change, was corrected by Sandra, who did it with pointed precision, making clear she was watching for exactly these kinds of errors. When Sandra turned away after the correction, James took one careful breath, reset himself, kept moving. He didn't make excuses, didn't look rattled, though his heart pounded and his hands wanted to shake. Linda saw it, caught his eye across the floor during a brief lull, gave him One small nod, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement she'd noticed the effort and was keeping it in the account. After morning rush cleared and lunch crew arrived, James gathered morning staff in the back near prep area. Thank you for today. I slowed some of you down, and I'm going to get faster. I also noticed things I want to address immediately. He checked his phone where he'd been keeping notes throughout the shift. Small observations written in stolen moments between tables. George, you were compensating for your left leg by end of shift, favoring it more as hours went on. How long has that been bothering you? George looked up from cleaning his station, expression of a man who hadn't expected to be the subject of observation, who'd assumed his small accommodations for pain were invisible. Few months. Concrete floor. It's manageable. It shouldn't have to be managed. Anti-fatigue mats for grill and prep stations are standard safety accommodation, and I'm submitting that request to facilities today as urgent priority. James looked around the small group. The walk-in cooler door required my full shoulder to open this morning. That's a safety issue, and I'm escalating it to facilities as urgent today, not adding it to some low-priority queue where it sits for months. He turned to Linda. Has that door been flagged before? Several times. Never moved up the priority list. It's moving up today. James looked back at assembled staff. What else is making your jobs harder that hasn't been addressed? What are you working around that should have been fixed? Silence. They weren't ready to trust him with that information yet, not ready to believe reporting problems would lead to solutions rather than retaliation. He understood that. Donald had taught them well. Okay, thank you for today. I'll see you tomorrow. As the group dispersed, Linda pulled him aside, voice low enough others couldn't hear. You didn't get rattled, not when Sandra corrected you in front of customers, not when Brent tested boundaries on that table reassignment. You stayed even. I wanted to get rattled. James admitted it quietly. I know. I could see the effort it took not to. That's actually more impressive than if staying calm had been easy. She handed him a facilities request form, the kind with multiple copies, requiring routing through official channels. Show me how you write up the cooler door. I want to see if your instinct for what to emphasize matches what'll actually get it prioritized. James wrote it up, citing specific safety codes, emphasizing liability exposure rather than just inconvenience. Linda read it, made one suggestion about which regulation to reference, let him resubmit it. It was, he'd realize later, the first real lesson disguised as a correction, offered without condescension or performance. That night, after Michael was asleep with Rex tucked under one arm and a drawing of Captain on the nightstand, James sat at the kitchen table making lists. Every employee's name and what he'd observed, things to follow up tomorrow, mistakes he'd made, and how to avoid repeating them. One line at the bottom, underlined, you made 3 mistakes today. Don't make the same ones twice. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, though he recognized the name in the signature. How was day 1? Elizabeth Mitchell. He stared at it a moment, then typed back, harder than almost anything I've done lately, but I think it's going to work. Her response came in under 2 minutes. I never doubted it. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's another day to prove it. James set down his phone, looked around the kitchen of the apartment that was, for the first time in 6 months, actually stable. 29 days left in his self-imposed trial period. He'd survived harder things. He could survive this. The month unfolded in layers. James arrived 5:30 every morning, using quiet before the first prep cook to review schedules, inventory reports, the 100 small details determining whether a shift ran smoothly or fell apart. He stayed late when schedule allowed, learning evening operations, building relationships with night crew, working every station until he understood not just how, but why and what could be improved. But Linda shaped those 30 days more than anyone else, and not always gently. When James made a scheduling decision that seemed perfectly reasonable, assigning 3 closing shifts in a row to Brent because Brent had requested evenings, Linda waited until staff meeting ended, then walked him through specifically, and without softening, exactly where the logic had failed. 3 consecutive closes meant 3 nights getting home past midnight, 3 mornings sleeping until 10, 3 days of disrupted rhythm that'd leave Brent exhausted and resentful by day 4, even if he'd initially wanted the shifts. You're thinking about filling slots. You need to think about human beings who have to live with the consequences. When James proposed a change to the prep checklist that'd theoretically save 15 minutes each morning, Linda asked 6 precise questions about downstream effects he hadn't considered. How that saved time in prep would create bottlenecks during service. How efficiency measured in minutes could cost quality measured in customer satisfaction. When he misread a customer situation and escalated to management unnecessarily, turning a minor complaint about wait times into a formal incident requiring documentation, Linda debriefed him 15 minutes in the back office with direct, unsentimental precision. Someone who believed learning from mistakes was only valuable if the learning was thorough and uncomfortable enough to stick. "You could be easier on me," James said it after one of those sessions, pride stinging from detailed dissection of everything he'd gotten wrong. "I could." Linda agreed, straightening papers on her desk with careful precision, her habit when choosing words that mattered. "I was easy on people 2 years under Donald because that was the only way to keep peace and protect staff from his worst impulses. You know what easy got me? 14 employees gone in 7 months and a restaurant falling apart because nobody could tell the truth about what was actually broken." She looked at him directly. "You have real instincts, James. Real ones, not performed ones. If I treat those instincts like they don't need sharpening, I'd be doing you a disservice. And I'd be doing a disservice to everyone in this building who depends on you making good decisions 6 months from now when I'm not standing beside you to catch mistakes before they land." She handed him the next morning's prep report. "So no, I'm not going to be easy on you. I'm going to be useful to you. Those are different things." Anti-fatigue mats arrived day 7. George stood on one during morning shift, said nothing about it to James, but James noticed that by shift end, George was moving differently, less careful with each step, less guardedly compensating for pain he'd been managing quietly for months. Day 21, a regular customer asked George how his leg was doing. George said better. Management finally got it sorted and went back to his grill. James happened to be within earshot. He filed it away as what it was, George's version of a thank you, offered in George's own language on George's own timeline. Walk-in cooler door was fixed day 9. The technician who came admitted the work order had been sitting in queue 4 months at low priority, bumped repeatedly by requests from locations whose managers knew how to phrase things in ways that got attention. It's high priority now. James' voice was flat, brooking no argument. Door was fixed that afternoon, hydraulic mechanism replaced entirely rather than patched. The difference was immediate. Door swinging open with light pressure instead of requiring full body weight. Employee meal policy was expanded day 11. Previous policy allowed 1 discounted meal per shift, but discount was minimal and restrictions extensive enough most staff had stopped bothering. New policy was simple: 1 full meal per shift from whatever was available, no approval required, no restrictions beyond basic reasonableness. Donald thought feeding people on the clock was charity. Linda's voice was dry when James brought the proposal. Donald was wrong about a lot of things. People can't do good work when they're hungry. That's not generosity, that's basic operations. She looked at him a moment. Say that exactly like that in the staff meeting. Not the part about Donald. The second part. James did. Sandra, in the back of the room, wrote something in the small notebook she'd started carrying, observations suggesting she was learning even when not officially being taught. Scheduling overhaul went into effect day 16. No more than 3 consecutive closing shifts per person. 2 guaranteed days off weekly, scheduled at least a week in advance so people could make plans. Whole system written clearly, posted in the break room where anyone could read and verify it. No hidden changes, no last-minute switches without consent. Brent studied the new schedule when it went up, standing in front of it almost a full minute. Expression unreadable. Fare is different from what I'm used to. He walked away without elaborating, but showed up on time for his next shift and stopped testing boundaries in small ways he'd been, which in Brent's particular operational language was a form of acknowledgement. Sandra began sitting in on morning management walkthroughs day 18, quietly, without drawing attention, standing slightly to the side, watching everything. James noticed but said nothing, filing it away as potentially significant. Linda noticed too, mentioned it that evening when they were reviewing the day's numbers. She asked me if it was all right to observe. I said yes. She didn't ask anything else. She's learning on her own initiative without being prompted. Pause while Linda pulled up labor costs on her tablet. You said something to her. What was it? I asked her what she actually wanted. Nobody had ever asked her that before. Linda was quiet a moment, fingers still on the screen, but not moving. I want you to think about what we do with that information. She's been here 4 years. She's 38. She's ready for more responsibility than she's been given, I know. Then we need to build a path for her that's real, not theoretical. If we tell her she has potential, then do nothing about it. We're just another version of what Donald did to her. The harder conversation came day 24. Sandra found James in the supply room during a quiet afternoon stretch, voice direct in the way of someone who'd been building toward a question for a while and finally decided to ask it. 4 years, consistent reviews, never a write-up. 2 regional assessors told me I had management potential. And you're here after 11 weeks. She held his gaze, expression neither hostile nor friendly, just determinedly neutral. I need you to be honest with me about why it's not fair. James met her eyes directly, not flinching from truth. What happened to me isn't fair to you or anyone else who's put in time here and proven themselves. I can't change that. He paused, choosing words carefully. What I can do is make sure that starting now, the door you've been standing in front of 4 years is actually open. Not as a gesture, not as a someday maybe promise, but as a real thing with real steps and real timeline. Sandra's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a slight easing of tension he wouldn't have noticed if he hadn't been watching closely. You've been learning the opening walkthroughs the past week. Keep going. Come to me in 60 days and show me what you've learned. I'm not handing you anything. I'm telling you the path is real and the door's open if you walk through it. She looked at him a long time, weighing something he couldn't see. 60 days. She walked out without saying anything else, but the set of her shoulders was different, straighter, like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying and was still getting used to moving without it. That evening, Linda and James sat in the office, going over the month's numbers, data that had formed the foundation of his performance review, when Elizabeth returned Friday. She's going to be ready for assistant manager before spring. Linda's voice was quiet but certain. I know. I want to be the one to tell her when the time comes. She's been here longer than you've been alive. It feels like sometimes. When she gets that news, it should come from someone who's been watching her the full 4 years, not just 2 months, someone who can tell her truthfully she earned it. That's the right call. Absolutely. Linda nodded once, then turned the laptop toward him so he could see the spreadsheet. Satisfaction scores up 14%. Turnover at zero for the month. Food waste down 6%. Revenue up 4%. Real numbers grounded in real changes. Nothing inflated or massaged to look better than it is. She closed the laptop. Elizabeth's coming Friday. What are you going to tell her? Linda was quiet a moment, organizing thoughts with the same deliberateness she organized everything. I'm going to tell her you've worked harder than any new manager I've seen, that you've made this building concretely better for people who work in it, and that I was wrong about you when I first heard about the promotion. Another pause. I'm also going to tell her Sandra needs to be on a formal development track starting next month, and that the Employee Support Fund needs to be communicated to every new hire at onboarding, not buried in a folder they might never open. Because you're not the only person who's ever walked through those doors with a situation like yours. And the next person shouldn't have to wait for the owner to show up in disguise before they find out help exists. She looked at him steadily. Now go home. It's 6:43 and Michael's at Angela's waiting for you. Elizabeth arrived Friday during lunch rush, exactly as intended. She sat in the same corner booth, watched James move through controlled chaos with quiet, specific authority. Not loud, not dramatic, never raising his voice or making a show of leadership. He simply redirected things with small adjustments that kept the whole system flowing. When George fell behind on a run of orders, James was at the grill without being summoned, working beside him rather than supervising from distance. When a table situation escalated over wait times, James handled it with an apology that sounded genuine and a concrete solution delivered before Linda had fully registered the developing problem. When two servers had a moment of friction over a table assignment that had somehow gotten doubled up, James said something brief and low that Elizabeth couldn't hear, and the friction dissolved immediately. He also made a mistake, directed a food runner to the wrong table, caught it 30 seconds later, corrected it himself, apologized to both the runner and affected customers, moved on without visible distress or defensive explanation. Elizabeth noted this carefully. Managers who absorbed their own errors cleanly and kept operations moving were rarer and more valuable than managers who were simply good when everything was going right. After Rush died back, James came to the booth and sat across from her, polo shirt showing sweat stains under the arms despite February cold outside. How do you think it went? Better than day one in most ways. I made one routing error today, and I miscounted a section of inventory this morning, had to redo the whole count. He said both things without apology and without performance, simply stating facts. The staff covers things proactively now without being asked. 6 weeks ago, nobody was doing that. People were managing their own stations and nothing else. Now they're watching the whole floor and adjusting before problems develop. Linda's assessment matches yours. Elizabeth pulled out her phone, showed him the email Linda had sent that morning. Lengthy, detailed, unambiguous in its recommendation. She also told me about Sandra and about the onboarding communication gap with the support fund. That second observation is an important catch. Should have been caught long ago, should have been caught by someone. By me, by anyone with eyes to see. If the fund exists and nobody knows about it, it might as well not exist at all. James's voice was firm. Agreed, we're fixing it company-wide, starting this month. Every new hire gets a 30-minute orientation session specifically about support resources, separate from general onboarding. No more burying it in handbooks. Elizabeth folded her hands on the table. As of today, your position is permanent with full compensation and benefits, as agreed. Congratulations. Relief that moved through his face was brief and quickly composed, but she caught it. That moment of pure, unguarded emotion before the professional mask slid back. Thank you. He was quiet a moment, hands resting flat on the table. There's a business management course at the community college, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 7 to 9. I've been looking at it 2 weeks, reading the syllabus, checking the schedule against my responsibilities here, and Michael's routine. James said it carefully, like something he'd been holding at arm's length, not quite allowing himself to want it fully until he knew whether wanting it was permitted. I think I want to register. Elizabeth looked at him, hearing something different in how he phrased it. Not flat pragmatism of someone checking a box on a career development plan, but something more tentative and real, something that looked like actual wanting rather than strategic positioning. Tell me what you're thinking. Michael asked me last week what college was. I told him it's where you go to learn things you want to spend your life doing. James cleared his throat, a small sound suggesting emotion he was working to control. He said I should go. Said I already know how to take care of him, so I should learn other things too. He's 7 years old. Yes, and he's right. Something moved through James's expression. Complicated layers of grief and love and particular tenderness of someone who'd found the person they'd do absolutely anything for. I set it down because I had to. When my father died, and I became Michael's only parent in any real sense, I had plans that didn't survive contact with reality. That was the right call, and I'd make it again without hesitation. Longer pause. But I don't have to keep it set down forever. I think I've been treating not wanting things as a form of loyalty to Michael. Like, if I want things for myself, it means I'm not fully committed to him. I don't think that's actually true anymore. It's not true. It never was. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly. Margaret told me something once I didn't believe until I was 40. She said, taking care of yourself isn't separate from taking care of people who depend on you. It's the same thing. You can't give what you don't have. James nodded slowly. My wife used to say something similar. Said you show up for people better when you're also showing up for yourself. She was right about most things. Register for the course. Linda will cover Tuesday and Thursday evenings. I'll confirm that with her today. James registered from his phone that same evening, sitting at the kitchen table after Michael was asleep. He looked at the confirmation screen a long time. Green checkmark, course code, room number, where he'd sit with other adults twice a week, trying to build toward futures that felt possible rather than theoretical. He thought about withdrawal letters he'd written after his father died, sitting at this same table. That version had made the only call available, had done what needed doing, hadn't looked back because looking back was a luxury he couldn't afford when forward was hard enough. He thought about Michael saying, "You already know how to take care of me." The absolute confidence in his small voice, the trust that his father would still be there even if his father was sometimes at class instead of home at 7:30. James closed the confirmation screen, went to check on his son. Michael was asleep with Rex tucked under one arm and a drawing of Captain wearing a graduation cap on the nightstand, something he and Angela had made together that afternoon. The drawing was objectively terrible, the kind of child art parents treasured despite or because of its enthusiastic lack of technical skill. James stood in the doorway a moment, doing what he'd learned to do in months after his father died, just making sure the world was still in order, that Michael was still breathing, that nothing had gone catastrophically wrong in the minutes since he'd last checked. Then he went to bed, knowing tomorrow would bring new challenges and that he was more ready for them than he'd been yesterday. 9 months into James's tenure, 9 months during which satisfaction scores had climbed steadily, and Sandra had formally begun a management development track, and Michael had developed strong opinions about correct cheese-to-bread ratio in grilled cheese sandwiches. Elizabeth's phone rang at 11:52 at night. She answered on the second ring, already reaching for the notepad she kept on the nightstand for exactly these calls. Ms. Mitchell, this is the charge nurse at Mercy General in Charlotte. We have Carol Mitchell here. You're listed as her emergency contact. She's stable, but she's asking for you." Elizabeth was in the air by 6 the next morning, first direct flight she could book on 2 hours' notice. Carol Mitchell was 82, sharp-tongued and sharper-minded, with particular fearlessness of a woman who'd spent 8 decades saying exactly what she thought, to exactly who needed to hear it, and had made peace with consequences long ago. The cardiac event was described by 3 different doctors as significant but not catastrophic, serious enough to require monitoring and treatment but not immediately life-threatening. Carol described it as an inconvenience and wanted to know when she could go home. Monitoring equipment stayed despite her protests. Elizabeth managed the company remotely from Charlotte, daily check-ins with Barbara for anything requiring direct attention, trusting her team for everything that didn't rise to genuine crisis level. She'd built systems for exactly this kind of absence, had spent years putting people and processes in place specifically so the company wouldn't collapse if she wasn't physically present every day. But by end of the second week, there were nights when fear that lived at the edges of daytime was harder to keep contained, when she found herself calling James after his closing shift checks, ostensibly for diner updates, but really because she needed to talk to someone who understood what it was like to watch someone you loved fight battles you couldn't fight for them. "How is she really?" James asked it one night, the question direct and unadorned. "She's stubborn about everything she can control and frightened about everything she can't," which she'd never say out loud, but I can see it anyway. Elizabeth looked out the hospital waiting room window at the parking structure below. Watching someone you've always seen as completely capable struggle with things that used to be simple. "It's harder than I expected. I know what that feels like." James's voice carried recognition, not borrowed from safe distance, but remembered from direct recent experience. "Those first months after my father died, after I became Michael's only parent, there were nights I sat in his doorway an hour just watching him breathe, because I needed to see his chest moving to believe he was still okay. I forgot to buy groceries one week, and we had cereal for 3 dinners in a row. I didn't even notice until Michael asked why we always had breakfast for dinner now. Pause. What helped was accepting what I actually couldn't do. I couldn't bring my father back. I couldn't bring Sarah back. I couldn't make it hurt less for Michael or make him understand why the world had taken away everyone who loved him except me. All I could do was be there every day, steady and consistent, so he knew that what was still standing was still standing." Another pause, longer. "Ms. Mitchell, the diner's genuinely covered. Linda and Sandra and George have this completely in hand. You're allowed to just be her daughter right now. That's enough. That's all anyone can do, and that's enough." They talked several times a week after that. Sometimes about Carol's slow, incremental progress, 3 steps with the walker, then 5, then 8. Sometimes about Michael, who'd appointed himself Angela's official kitchen assistant and had achieved what Angela called impressive beginner proficiency with scrambled eggs. Sometimes about diner operations. Sometimes about nothing much at all. Small, ordinary things that were easy to talk about when everything else was heavy. The call came during week 5 of Elizabeth's stay in Charlotte. 3:45 in the afternoon, Angela's number showing on James's phone while he was reviewing inventory reports in the back office. "James, it's Angela. Michael fell at the playground. His arm might be broken. I'm sorry, I was watching, but he was climbing and he just slipped. I'm on my way. Which emergency room?" "Mercy. General Pediatric. I'm following the ambulance." James was out the door in 30 seconds, calling Linda as he ran. "Michael's hurt. I have to go. I'm sorry. Go. I have it. Call me when you know something." The emergency room was the particular kind of controlled chaos pediatric ERs always were. Crying children, worried parents, medical staff moving with practiced efficiency through triage and treatment. James found Angela in the waiting area, her face tight with worry and guilt. "I'm so sorry. He was on the monkey bars and his hand slipped. It's not your fault. Kids fall. Where is he? Treatment room 3. They're doing x-rays now." 20 minutes later, a doctor emerged with films and diagnosis. Clean break of the left radius, would need a cast for 6 weeks. No surgery required, but painful and limiting. Michael was brought out with his arm in a temporary splint, face tear-streaked, but brave. Rex clutched in his good hand. "Dad, it really hurts. I know, buddy. They're going to make it better." James sat in the chair beside the treatment bed while they applied the cast, holding Michael's good hand, making conversation about what color cast to choose and whether dinosaurs ever broke their arms and if Captain would sign the cast when they saw him next. The cast was blue, Michael's favorite color. By 6 that evening, they were home. Michael's arm in a sling, pain medication starting to take the edge off. James got him settled on the couch with Rex and a movie. Was starting to think about dinner when his phone rang. Linda's voice was apologetic. "Regional assessment call tomorrow at 10 a.m. Elizabeth's flying back from Charlotte for it. You're supposed to present the Clearwater restructure plan. It's the last piece before she makes the decision about the regional role." James looked at Michael on the couch, small face still pale with pain and stress, cast bright against his dark skin. "Linda, I can't. Michael just got home from the ER. I'm not leaving him." Silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. "I'll present for you. You stay with Michael. That's the right call." James felt something in his chest ease and tighten simultaneously. Relief and fear mixed together. This was the final assessment. "If I'm not there, then I'll tell Elizabeth exactly why you're not there. And if that costs you the promotion, then the promotion wasn't worth having anyway." Linda's voice was firm. "You stay with your son. That's what good fathers do. That's what good people do. The rest will work itself out." James woke at 6 the next morning, still on the couch, Michael asleep against his shoulder, Rex fallen to the floor. His back ached from the awkward position, and his phone showed 4 missed calls from Elizabeth's number between midnight and 2 a.m., times when she'd probably been sitting in a hospital room in Charlotte unable to sleep. He was starting coffee when the knock came at the door. 7:15 in the morning, too early for visitors, his first thought going to emergencies and bad news, before his brain caught up and reminded him bad news didn't usually knock. Elizabeth stood in the hallway outside his apartment, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of business attire, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with the early hour. "Linda told me about Michael." "How is he?" "He's okay. Broken radius. Cast for 6 weeks. Hurts, but he'll heal. Can I come in?" James stepped aside, suddenly aware of how small the apartment was, how worn the furniture, toys scattered across the floor, and breakfast dishes still in the sink from yesterday. Elizabeth walked in, looked around with assessing gaze, someone who saw details and drew conclusions from them. Bookshelf with Michael's school photos and James's community college textbooks. Small kitchen table where they ate dinner every night. Couch where Michael was still asleep, cast propped on a pillow. Rex recovered from the floor and tucked back into the crook of his good arm. "James, you chose right." Elizabeth's voice was quiet, but absolutely certain. "What?" "This morning, the assessment call. Linda said you chose to stay with Michael instead of presenting the plan. You chose right." James felt his throat tighten. "I thought I might have just cost myself the regional position. If staying with your injured child when he needs you would cost you a promotion, then the company offering that promotion doesn't deserve you." Elizabeth walked over to the couch, looking down at Michael. "Margaret taught me something I didn't understand until much later. She said the measure of a leader isn't what they do when everything's easy. It's what they do when they have to choose between 2 things that both matter. You chose your son. That's not weakness. That's leadership." She turned back to James. "Linda presented the Clearwater plan. She did an excellent job. But more importantly, she told me you're ready for the regional role now, not in 6 months. She wrote a formal recommendation last week, has been waiting for the right moment to give it to me. James sat down heavily in the nearest chair. She did what? She recommended you for immediate promotion, said you've demonstrated more growth in 4 months than most managers show in 2 years, and that when your son was hurt, you made the choice that proved you understand what matters. Elizabeth pulled an envelope from her bag, set it on the table. 5 locations, regional manager, $65,000 a year. You report directly to me. We talk every week about what's working and what needs adjustment. Pause. What about Michael with the longer hours and travel? James looked at his son sleeping on the couch, blue cast already starting to collect small scribbles and drawings Angela had helped him add yesterday. Angela and I talked about extended hours on travel days. She's willing. Childcare fund covers it. Michael's stable now. He has school, friends, Angela and Captain. He told me last month he wants to work in restaurants when he grows up. Specifically, he wants to be my assistant. Elizabeth smiled. First genuine smile James had seen on her face since she'd arrived in Charlotte weeks ago. Then we have a deal. Congratulations, Regional Manager Walker. The 5 locations spread across Georgia and Tennessee, like points on a map James studied late at night after Michael was asleep. Eastfield, 20 miles north. Riverside, 40 miles east. Lakefront, an hour south. Clearwater, the problem child, 90 minutes west in a town that had seen better days. Each one a small universe with its own rhythms, its own problems, its own manager who'd been running things their own way for years and now had to answer to a 25-year-old who'd been serving tables 6 months ago. James spent the first 2 weeks just watching. He'd arrive unannounced during morning prep or evening service, sit in corner booths with coffee and notepads, observe how each location breathed. Eastfield ran tight under Stephen Clark, a 55-year-old who'd been in the business 30 years and made it clear through every interaction that he didn't need advice from someone young enough to be his son. Riverside struggled under Melissa Hernandez, 32 and energetic, but drowning in details she couldn't quite organize into systems. Lakefront limped along with Andrew Jackson, 29 and conflict avoidant, to the point that problems festered until they exploded. Clearwater, under Gary Thomas, 58 and bitter, had stopped trying years ago. The pattern emerged clearly. These weren't bad managers. They were people who'd learned to operate in isolation, who'd developed their own methods through trial and error, who'd been told they were responsible for results, but given no resources to achieve them. Donald Harris had been symptom, not disease. The disease was neglect, dressed up as autonomy. James started with Eastfield because Stephen was the hardest sell, and if he couldn't win Stephen, the rest would be impossible. He showed up at 5:30 on a Tuesday morning, walked into the kitchen where Stephen was prepping for the day. "Mr. Clark, I need your help with something." Stephen looked up from cutting vegetables, knife pausing mid-motion. "That's so. Not a question, a challenge. I've been looking at your numbers. Satisfaction scores highest in the region, food waste lowest, labor costs controlled without sacrificing service quality. You're doing something right that the other locations aren't." Stephen set down the knife, wiped his hands on his apron. "Been doing this a long time. Long. You figure things out. That's what I need. I've got 4 other locations that need to figure things out. I could come in and tell them what to do based on corporate policy and best practices, but policy doesn't account for reality. You do." James pulled out his notepad, flipped to a clean page. "Walk me through your morning prep sequence. Why you do it in this order and not another way. What you learned the hard way that nobody taught you." Stephen studied him for a long moment, weighing whether this was genuine or performance. "You really want to know, or you just want me to think you care?" "I really want to know, because in 4 months I'm going to be standing in Clearwater trying to help Gary Thomas fix a location that's been broken a long time, and I need to understand what actually works, not what's supposed to work. Stephen picked up his knife again, resumed cutting, but started talking. 45 minutes later, James had filled 6 pages with notes about prep sequencing, inventory rotation, staff communication patterns, small adjustments that saved hours over a week. Stephen had warmed from suspicious to cautiously engaged, the shift happening so gradually James couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. "You going to take all this and just implement it everywhere?" Stephen's question came as James was packing up his notepad. "No, I'm going to take what makes sense for each location's specific situation and adapt it. Your prep sequence works because you've got a kitchen layout that supports it and a morning crew that's been stable for 2 years. Melissa's got neither of those things. She needs something different." Stephen nodded slowly. "You might actually know what you're doing. I'm learning what I'm doing. There's a difference." "Yeah, there is." Stephen turned back to his prep work, but added without looking up, "You need anything else? You call. Don't care what time." Riverside took a different approach. Melissa was drowning not from lack of skill, but from lack of structure. Her office looked like a paper bomb had detonated. Invoices, mixed with schedules, mixed with health department notices, mixed with employee requests. She worked harder than anyone James had met, regularly pulling 12-hour days, but the harder she worked, the more behind she fell. James spent 2 full days at Riverside just watching her move through a shift. The problem became obvious by hour 3. Every decision required her direct involvement. Every question came to her. Every small crisis escalated to her desk. She'd created a system where she was the single point of failure, and she was failing from exhaustion. On day 3, James came in with a whiteboard and set it up in her office. "We're going to build you a decision tree. Every question that came to you yesterday, we're going to map out who should actually be handling it, and what authority they need to handle it without asking you." Melissa looked at the whiteboard like it was alien technology. "But I'm the manager. I'm supposed to make the decisions. You're supposed to make decisions that require your specific judgment and experience. You're not supposed to spend 20 minutes deciding whether to reorder tomatoes when your inventory lead is perfectly capable of reading a stock sheet." They spent 6 hours building the tree. By the end, Melissa had a visual map of which decisions stayed with her, which went to shift leads, which went to inventory, which went to whoever was on duty and just needed clear guidelines. The relief on her face was physical. "I thought asking for help meant I was failing. Asking for help means you're smart enough to know you can't do everything alone." "Nobody can." James left her with instructions to test the system for 2 weeks and call him if it started breaking down. She called 3 times in the first week, not because the system was breaking, but because she wanted to confirm she was doing it right. Each time, James reminded her she was the manager, and if it was working, it was right. Lakefront required a different kind of intervention. Andrew Jackson was technically competent, but emotionally avoidant. He'd rather let a problem fester for weeks than have a difficult conversation that might create momentary discomfort. His staff had learned to exploit this, pushing boundaries until the whole operation existed in a gray area where nobody was quite sure what the rules were or whether they mattered. James watched Andrew avoid firing someone who desperately needed to be fired, a server who showed up late, complained constantly, created drama, and drove away every competent coworker until the only people left were those who couldn't get jobs elsewhere. After the shift, James sat Andrew down in his office. "How long has Marcus been a problem?" Andrew shifted in his chair. "Few months. He's going through a tough time. Divorce, custody issues. How many good employees have quit because of him?" Andrew looked at his desk. 3, maybe 4. So you've sacrificed 4 good employees to avoid one difficult conversation with one bad employee. Put like that, it sounds like exactly what happened, and it's going to keep happening until you decide that protecting your good employees matters more than avoiding discomfort. James leaned forward. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call Marcus in here and you're going to tell him his employment is terminated, effective immediately.
I'll be in the dining room if you need backup, but you're going to do it yourself. I don't know if I can.
You can. You just haven't had to yet. Tomorrow, you have to. The next morning, Andrew spent 20 minutes in his office with Marcus. James heard raised voices, heard the door slam. Andrew emerged looking shaken, but also somehow straighter. That was the hardest thing I've done in this job. Good. Now you know you can do hard things when they matter. The lunch shift that day ran smoother than any James had observed at Lakefront. Word spread fast. The staff realized the rules actually meant something now, that consequences existed, that the manager would protect them from toxic coworkers instead of protecting toxic coworkers from consequences. But Clearwater was the real test. Gary Thomas had been managing that location for 12 years, watching the town slowly die around him as factories closed and young people moved away, and the customer base dwindled to retirees on fixed incomes and truckers passing through. He'd stopped believing anything could improve, stopped trying to improve it, settled into bitter maintenance of a declining enterprise. James made 7 trips to Clearwater before Gary would even talk to him, beyond one-word answers. On the 8th trip, he arrived at 4 in the morning and started doing the prep work himself, cutting vegetables, setting up stations, getting everything ready for the day. Gary arrived at 5, found James already deep into the work. "The hell are you doing? Your morning prep guy called in sick. Figured the work needed doing." Gary stared at him a long moment, then picked up a knife and started working alongside him. They prepped in silence for 20 minutes before Gary spoke. "You don't have to do this. You're regional manager. This isn't your job. My job is making sure this location succeeds. Right now, that means cutting onions." Another silence longer. "This place is dying. Has been for years. You can't fix a dying town." "No, but I can make sure the people working here have a fair shot at doing good work and getting paid fairly for it. I can make sure when somebody comes in hungry and tired after a long shift at the warehouse, they get a good meal and decent service. That's not fixing the town. That's doing what we can with what we've got." Gary's knife paused. "Been doing this 20 years. Seen every corporate initiative, every new program, every big idea that was supposed to save everything. They all fail." "You're right. They do. Because they're ideas from people who've never cut onions at 4 in the morning, never worked a double when they had the flu, never had to choose between buying groceries and fixing their car." "You want to know why I think this might work differently? Why? Because I was a single father making $9 an hour 6 months ago. I know exactly what it feels like to be on the other side of every policy I'm implementing. And I'm not here to save anything. I'm here to make it less brutal for the people doing the work." Gary set down his knife. "My daughter's 22. Works retail in the next town over. Manager treats her like dirt. She's afraid to quit because she needs the money. I've been that manager for 15 years and never saw it until you said that just now." James looked at him. "So stop being that manager. Be the manager you'd want your daughter to have." They finished prep in silence, but the silence felt different, less hostile, more thoughtful. Over the next 3 months, Gary slowly transformed Clearwater. Not dramatically. No sudden turnaround. Just steady, incremental improvement built on small changes. Treating staff like they mattered. Listening when they flagged problems. Fixing things that had been broken so long everyone had stopped mentioning them. By month 9, James had systems running at all 5 locations. Not Identical systems, each one adapted to its specific reality, its specific staff, its specific challenges. Satisfaction scores were up across the board. Turnover was down, revenue hadn't increased much. You couldn't squeeze blood from stones, but efficiency had improved enough that labor costs dropped while service quality rose. Elizabeth called him on a Friday evening, her voice carrying something he couldn't quite identify. "I need you in Atlanta Monday morning, 9 a.m. Bring your laptop and anything you've been documenting about the 5-location rollout. Everything okay? Everything's fine. Just need you here." He made arrangements with Angela for extended morning coverage, left Michael with detailed instructions about homework and dinner, drove to Atlanta Sunday evening, and stayed at a hotel that felt too expensive, even though Sterling was paying for it. Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp, he walked into Sterling's corporate headquarters for the first time. Glass and steel, open floor plan, the kind of workplace that signaled success in a language James was still learning to read. Elizabeth met him in the lobby, led him to a conference room where 3 people sat waiting. "James, this is our executive team. You've met Barbara on the phone. This is Richard Chen, CFO, and Sarah Martinez, VP of Operations." They shook hands, everyone settling around the table. Elizabeth opened her laptop. "We've been tracking the 5-location pilot closely. Richard, walk him through the numbers." Richard pulled up a presentation. Charts showing satisfaction scores, labor costs, turnover rates, revenue per labor hour, all trending in the right direction across all 5 locations. More importantly, trending consistently, suggesting sustainable change rather than temporary spike. These numbers are remarkable for the timeline. 4 months from initial intervention to measurable systemic improvement. Most regional restructures take 18 months to show this level of change. Sarah leaned forward. "What we want to understand is how much of this is specific to you being personally present versus how much is transferable methodology. Can we scale this?" James thought carefully before answering. "The methodology is transferable. The principles are simple. Listen to managers who've been doing the work. Identify real constraints versus perceived constraints. Build systems that match reality rather than forcing reality to match systems. That can scale." He paused. "What can't scale is the relationship piece. I spent 6 months building trust with 5 managers before any of them would actually tell me the truth about what was broken. You can't compress that timeline. You can't manufacture that trust. It has to be earned through showing up consistently and following through on every commitment, even small ones, so it scales slowly." Sarah's voice was neutral. "It scales at the speed of trust, which is slower than policy rollout, but faster than waiting for problems to explode into crises that require expensive emergency interventions." Richard and Sarah exchanged glances. Elizabeth closed her laptop. "We want to expand the pilot to 15 locations across 3 states. You'd be promoted to Director of Regional Operations. Salary is $85,000. You'd have 2 regional managers reporting to you, covering the 15 locations. But you'd maintain direct oversight of the original 5 for continuity. It's a lot of travel, 2 to 3 days a week." "What does that look like with Michael?" James's mind was racing, but his voice stayed level. "Michael's 9 now. He's stable, doing well in school, has a good support system with Angela. The child care fund would cover extended hours on travel days. He and I would need to have a serious conversation about what this means for our routine, but I think we could make it work." He met Elizabeth's eyes. "I want to be clear about something. I won't take a position that requires me to sacrifice being Michael's father. If this role requires that, I need to know now." "It doesn't." Elizabeth's voice was firm. "The travel is predictable. You'd be home every weekend. You'd have input on the schedule. And if Michael needs you, same rule applies. You go every time, whatever it takes. That's in writing." James looked at Richard and Sarah. "Why me? You could hire someone with an MBA and 10 years of regional management experience. We could. Sarah's voice was dry. We'd pay them twice what we're offering you, and they'd spend the first year implementing standardized systems that'd ignore local reality and generate reports that looked good on paper while problems got worse on the ground. We've done that. It doesn't work. She tapped the presentation on her laptop. What works is someone who understands the difference between managing spreadsheets and managing human beings. Someone who'll spend 4 hours at a grill with a bitter 58-year-old because that's what it takes to reach him. That's not in any MBA curriculum. James sat back in his chair, processing. I need to talk to Michael. I need to make sure Angela can handle the extended schedule. I need to understand exactly what the travel pattern looks like so I can explain it to a 9-year-old in terms that make sense to him. Elizabeth slid a folder across the table. Sample schedule for the next quarter. Take it home. Talk to Michael. Talk to Angela. Call me by end of week. James took the folder, shook hands with everyone, left the building feeling like he'd just been offered something that was either the best opportunity of his life or a trap that would blow up in ways he couldn't predict yet. That night, after homework and dinner, James sat Michael down on the couch with Rex between them. Buddy, I need to talk to you about something important. Michael set down his drawing, gave James his full attention with the seriousness he'd carried since he was small. Remember how I've been going to visit different restaurants to help them run better? Yeah, you go to Clearwater a lot. That's the one where Mr. Gary works. Right. Well, Ms. Mitchell wants me to do that with more restaurants, 15 instead of 5. But that means I'd have to travel more. I'd be gone 2 or 3 days a week, home every weekend. You'd stay with Angela those nights. Michael was quiet, processing. His hand found Rex, held the worn plastic dinosaur the way he always did when thinking through something difficult. Would you call every night, every single night, before bed so we can talk about your day? Would you still come to my school things, like the science fair, every one? I'd make sure my travel schedule never conflicts with your school events. That's a promise. Another silence. Michael's thumb traced the spine of the T-Rex. Would we still have pancake Sundays? Absolutely. That's not negotiable. Michael looked up at him. Is this a good job? Like, is it important? It's a really good job. It means I could help a lot more people, make more restaurants better for the people working there, and it means we'd have more money, which means you could do more activities if you want, and we'd have savings for college someday. Does it make you happy? James felt his throat tighten. It makes me feel like the work I'm doing matters, like I'm building something that'll last longer than just this week or this month. Yeah, buddy, it makes me happy. Michael was quiet a long moment, then looked at James with those serious eyes that always seemed too old for his face. Mom used to say, you're good at taking care of people. I think you should take the job. James pulled Michael into a hug, careful of the arm that had healed from the break months ago, but still deserved gentleness. You sure? Yeah, but you have to promise the phone calls and the pancakes. I promise both. Deal? Deal. James called Elizabeth Friday morning. I'll take it. Start date 2 weeks. Gives me time to transition Clayton's fully to Linda and brief whoever's taking over the original 5 location oversight. You're keeping the original 5. They're your foundation. We're hiring the 2 new regional managers to cover the expansion. Elizabeth's voice carried satisfaction. First day is Monday after next. You'll meet your new team then. Congratulations, Director Walker. The expansion rolled out over 6 months. James hired 2 regional managers, Kenneth Martinez, 38, with restaurant experience and humility, and Patricia Thompson, 42, sharp and organized. He trained them the same way Linda had trained him, specifically, honestly, without softening the hard parts. The 15 locations varied wildly. Some needed systems, some needed culture change, some needed permission to stop doing stupid things that had never made sense, but nobody had ever questioned. James spent 3 days a week on the road, visiting locations, sitting with managers, listening to complaints and suggestions, and the small observations that revealed big problems. He called Michael every night at 8:30, no matter where he was. Sometimes from hotel rooms, sometimes from diner parking lots, sometimes from rest stops between locations. They talked about homework and captain and whether Stegosaurus could beat Triceratops in a fight. Small conversations that kept the thread connected. Weekends were sacred. Friday nights, James drove home, walked in the door, and became just dad again. Saturday mornings, they made pancakes. Sunday afternoons, they went to the park or the library or just stayed home, building elaborate scenarios with Michael's growing collection of dinosaurs. Monday mornings, James left again, but the rhythm held. By month 6, the 15-location pilot showed results matching the original 5. By month 9, Elizabeth was talking about expanding to 30 locations. By month 12, James was running operational oversight for 42 locations across 5 states with a team of 6 regional managers reporting to him. And then Donald Harris filed his lawsuit. The summons arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. James was in his office reviewing quarterly reports when Barbara called. "You need to come to Atlanta. Today, we have a legal situation. James made it to corporate in 90 minutes. Elizabeth, Richard, Sarah, and Sterling's legal counsel were waiting in the conference room. The atmosphere was tight. Donald Harris is suing Sterling Restaurant Group for wrongful termination and discrimination. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen Park, pushed a thick document across the table. He's alleging he was fired to cover up nepotism, specifically hiring you based on personal favor rather than qualifications. He's claiming racial discrimination, arguing that as a white manager, he was terminated to make room for a black employee despite his superior experience and track record. James felt his stomach drop. That's insane. He was terminated for abusive conduct. I was hired because Elizabeth witnessed him abusing employees and chose to intervene. I know. We know. The facts support us completely. Helen's voice was calm. But this is going to discovery and potentially trial, which means depositions, which means you'll be questioned under oath about your hiring, your qualifications, your relationship with Elizabeth. They're going to try to make this look like favoritism. What do you need from me? The truth, documented and consistent. Helen pulled out another folder. We're going to prepare you for deposition. You'll be questioned by Harris's attorney. They'll try to rattle you, make you defensive, get you to say something they can twist. You stay calm, answer only what's asked. Don't elaborate. Elizabeth leaned forward. James, I want you to understand something. This lawsuit is designed to be expensive and distracting. Harris knows he can't win on the facts. He's trying to extract a settlement by making the fight too costly to pursue. We're not settling. We're going to court if necessary. What's the timeline? 6 months to a year. Discovery starts next month. The next 3 months were brutal. Depositions, document requests, interrogatories. James sat across a conference table from Harris's attorney, a smooth-talking man in an expensive suit, who asked questions designed to sound innocent but carried implications like landmines. Mr. Walker, you'd never managed a restaurant before Ms. Mitchell hired you, correct? Correct. You had no formal business education? I was enrolled in community college courses in business management at the time of promotion, but no degree. Correct. And Ms. Mitchell offered you the assistant manager position within 24 hours of meeting you? She offered it the day after the incident at Clayton's, yes. Seems quite fast for such an important decision. Would you say Ms. Mitchell was motivated by sympathy for your personal situation, rather than objective assessment of your qualifications? James kept his voice level. Ms. Mitchell was motivated by witnessing competent work performed under difficult circumstances and recognizing potential that others had overlooked. Same thing happened to her 40 years ago. Same thing she'd been doing her entire career. The attorney smiled. So you're saying this is a pattern. Ms. Mitchell has a history of making emotional hiring decisions based on personal identification with candidates. I'm saying Ms. Mitchell has a history of recognizing talent in unconventional places and giving people opportunities to prove themselves. The results speak for themselves. Richard's testimony was clinical. Revenue data, turnover statistics, satisfaction scores, all showing improvement under James's leadership across 42 locations. Harder to argue with spreadsheets than feelings. Elizabeth's deposition lasted 6 hours. James read the transcript later. She never wavered, never got defensive, answered every question with calm precision. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true you fired my client specifically to create an opening for Mr. Walker? I fired your client for documented pattern of abusive conduct across 3 locations spanning 8 years, resulting in 14 employee separations in 7 months at Clayton's alone. Mr. Walker's hiring was a separate decision made because he demonstrated exceptional competence under observation. But you made that hiring decision within 24 hours. I made that decision after 90 minutes of direct observation followed by thorough background investigation. I've been evaluating restaurant employees for 27 years. I know what competence looks like. By month 4 of the legal process, Harris's case was falling apart. 2 of his 3 employee witnesses withdrew, unwilling to lie under oath. The third, a former employee fired for theft, had credibility problems that made him useless. Discovery produced the 7 complaints filed against Harris over 8 years, all documented, all showing the pattern Elizabeth had described. In month 5, Harris's attorney approached Helen Park about settlement. We'll dismiss if Sterling agrees to a confidential settlement of $150,000. Helen called Elizabeth. Elizabeth called James. What do you think? James didn't hesitate. No, not $1. This isn't about money. This is about him trying to punish you for doing the right thing and punish me for existing. We take it to trial. Elizabeth was quiet a moment. Trial is expensive, public, stressful. You'll be on the witness stand. Your personal life will be examined. Michael might hear things. I know. We still don't settle. Agreed. Harris withdrew the lawsuit 2 weeks before trial date, unable to find an attorney willing to argue a case with no facts and no witnesses. Helen Park sent the final dismissal order with a note. Your instinct was right. Never reward extortion. 18 months after James had been fired by Donald Harris, 18 months during which he'd gone from unemployed single father to director of regional operations overseeing 42 locations, Elizabeth called him to Atlanta again. Not the conference room this time, her private office, the one with the single photograph of Margaret Wilson on the credenza, closed the door. James closed it, sat across from her desk. Elizabeth slid an envelope across the polished wood. Don't open this until you're alone, but I want to tell you what's in it before you leave. She folded her hands, met his eyes directly. Margaret Wilson gave me 10% of her hotel when she was dying. Not because I'd earned it financially, because she said the greatest wealth is knowing when to give it away. I didn't understand then. I do now. James's heart started pounding. That envelope contains documentation transferring 5% of Sterling Restaurant Group to you. Current valuation puts it at approximately $2.1 million. It's yours, with one condition. She leaned forward. You don't get to refuse it. Not because I won't let you, but because refusing it would mean you don't understand what I'm trying to tell you. James opened his mouth, closed it again. Elizabeth continued. This isn't payment for work. This is responsibility. You're not just managing restaurants anymore. You're building the culture that'll outlive both of us. This gives you stake in that. Voice at the table when decisions get made about the future. She pulled out a second envelope, older and yellowed. This is the letter Margaret wrote me when she gave me that 10%. I've kept it 40 years. You should read it. James took the envelope, hands shaking slightly. The paper inside was delicate, the handwriting careful. Victoria, the only thing you really own is what you choose to do when someone needs help and you're standing there. Don't let them tell you business and compassion are separate things. They're the same thing. Pass it forward. Margaret James had set the letter down carefully. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet. Go home. Talk to Michael. Think about what this means. Then call me. James drove home in a daze. That night, after Michael was asleep, he opened the first envelope and read the legal documents. 5%, 2.1 million. Real money that could change everything. College fully funded, house instead of apartment. Security that went beyond next month's rent. He thought about Margaret Wilson giving Elizabeth 10%, about Elizabeth giving him 5%, about the weight of that trust and what it meant to be worthy of it. The next morning, Saturday pancakes, Michael drowning his stack in syrup while Rex stood guard over the butter dish. Bud, I need to tell you something. Miss Mitchell gave me part of her company. It's worth a lot of money. Enough that we could buy a house if we wanted. Enough that college is completely paid for. Enough that things are going to be different. Michael looked up, syrup on his chin. Different how? Better. More secure. You could do any activities you want. We could take vacations. We could save for your future. Michael considered this seriously. Are you still going to make pancakes on Sundays? Always. Are you still going to call every night when you travel? Every night. Then it's not really that different. It's just the same us with more money. James felt his eyes sting. Yeah, that's exactly right. He called Elizabeth Monday morning. I want to accept this, but I want to earn it first. Give me 5 years. If I'm still here, still building, still doing right by the people working in these restaurants, then I'll take it. If I fail, you get it back. Elizabeth was silent so long, James thought the call had dropped. My father would have liked you very much. Another pause. 5 years. But I'm holding you to it. 5 years later, James walked into Sterling's annual leadership meeting as a 30-year-old who'd gone from server to director of regional operations to VP of franchise development. Michael was 12, thriving, still carrying Rex everywhere, though the dinosaur was now held together mostly by glue and hope. Sandra Rodriguez ran Clayton's as full manager, having been promoted through assistant manager over 3 years of steady growth. Linda Brown had moved to corporate, heading Sterling's new Manager Development Institute, a 6-month training program built on the principles James had learned from her. George White had retired, leaving his grill station to his son, Marcus, passing down technique and standards like an inheritance. Gary Thomas's daughter Amanda worked at Clearwater now, hired by her father, who'd transformed into the manager he'd wished she'd had. Stephen Clark mentored 3 new managers, teaching them the morning prep sequence that had become Sterling's standard across 40 states. Melissa Hernandez ran regional operations for the Southwest, using the decision tree she and James had built years ago. The leadership meeting ran 2 days. On the second afternoon, Elizabeth stood at the podium. Before we close, I want to recognize someone. 5 years ago, James Walker made me a promise. He said if he was still here in 5 years, still building, still doing right by our people, he'd accept something I'd offered. James, stand up. James stood, feeling his face warm as 200 people turned to look. You kept your promise. You're still here. You're still building. And today, we're announcing your promotion to Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately, along with the ownership stake we agreed to 5 years ago. Elizabeth smiled. The greatest thing you can do with a second chance is make sure someone else gets one too. You've given hundreds of people that second chance. Thank you. The room erupted in applause. James saw Linda in the front row, tears on her face. Saw Sandra, filming on her phone to show the Clayton's crew, saw Kenneth and Patricia and every regional manager he'd trained standing and clapping. That night, he called Michael from the hotel. "Big news, buddy. I got promoted. Chief Operating Officer. That's the really important one, right?" "Yeah, it's the really important one." Silence on the line. Then, "Mom would be really proud of you." James's throat closed. "Yeah, she would. Dad, too. Are you coming home tomorrow? First thing in the morning. Pancakes are at 9. I'll have Rex ready. He wants to celebrate, too." After he hung up, James sat in the hotel room looking out at Atlanta's skyline, thinking about the rain-soaked morning 18 months ago when he'd walked out of Clayton's carrying Michael with nowhere to go. Thinking about Elizabeth sitting in a corner booth, watching. Thinking about Margaret Wilson and Carol Mitchell, and every person who'd ever chosen to see someone who needed help and decided to be the one standing there. His phone buzzed. Text from Elizabeth. "One more thing. Check your email." James opened his laptop. The email contained a single attachment, a photograph. Margaret Wilson and a younger Elizabeth, standing outside a small hotel in Chattanooga, both smiling. Below it, "She would have been proud of you, too. Keep passing it forward." E. James forwarded the photo to his team with a message. "This is why we do what we do. Every person in this photo was once someone nobody believed in. Be the person who believes. See you Monday." He closed the laptop, set an alarm for 6 a.m., and went to bed. Tomorrow, he'd drive home. Tomorrow, he'd make pancakes with Michael. Tomorrow, he'd keep building, keep showing up, keep choosing to see people who needed help, and deciding to be the one standing there. The work was never finished. That was the point. You didn't do this for the ending. You did it for the next person who needed a chance, and the person after that, and the person after that. The ripple moving outward through water, touching shores you'd never see. All you need is one person willing to bet on you, and then you become the person willing to bet on someone else. That was the whole story. Everything else was just details.